There is no evidence, according to all the studies and the research done, that American Muslims seek to replace the US Constitution with either Sharia or Islamic law. American Muslims, like other religious communities, understand Sharia as a personal religious obligation governing the practice of their faith. And yet, fast forward to 2012, and the fear, ignorance, sometimes hate of Islam and Muslims has been exploited for profit and political gain by many organizations, individuals, think tanks, and politicians who are part of the network we have deemed the Islamophobia network. As profiled in our 2011 investigative report, a product of 6 months' worth of research entitled Fear Incorporated, The Roots of the Islamophobia Network in America. Here's a shameless plug. I get no money for this. It's available online. It's called Fear Inc. If you go to Sheikh Google and type in Fear Inc., you will get the entire report online. We have broken up for communities to use. It's very new media friendly. I suggest you please Google it, or if you want a direct copy, Cap will send it to you. 15 minutes? I'm perfectly on time. Awesome. Are you guys still with me? Have I bored you to death? All right, good. So let's talk about Fear Inc. Let's talk about how, even though the US system is working perfectly, we have not been infiltrated by any religious law. Why, oh why, are mainstream politicians sitting there during the Republican debates talking about the Sharia threat? Again, Fear Incorporated, the roots of the Islamophobia network. Let's talk about the network. Specifically, what we found in 6 months of investigation is that 7 funders, over a period of 10 years, specifically from 2001 to 2009, have given over $43 million to this network to mainstream Islamophobic memes and messages, and mainstream them. That's a key word. Specifically, they are responsible for mainstreaming fear, bigotry, and hate against Islam and Muslims in America. They are behind the recent fictitious Sharia threat, and also behind the quote-unquote Ground Zero Mosque of 2010, which, you guys know those protests against Ground Zero Mosque? Remember that? It was actually not at Ground Zero nor a mosque. It was the Park 51 Community Center. And yet, right before the 2010 elections, a local issue became a national issue, became an international controversy that actually affected our national security. It was a manufactured controversy, and as Fear Inc. shows, it was created specifically by the Islamophobia network. In fact, the Anti-Sharia legislation, which is now in 24 states, has been debunked and criticized by the American Bar Association, which is an organization featuring 400,000 American lawyers, and the ACLU. Yet it still exists. So before I begin and really detail what the Islamophobia network is, I think we should have a quick definition of Islamophobia. It's a mouthful. Islamophobia in the 21st century, specifically in the past 10 years, as we see it, the resurgence of Islamophobia in America can be defined as the following. Islamophobia is the exaggerated fear, hatred, and hostility toward Islam and Muslims that is perpetuated by negative stereotypes, resulting in bias, discrimination, and this is the key, marginalization and exclusion of Muslims from America's social, political, and civic life. You guys still with me? Okay. Why is Fear Incorporated, why is this report so relevant? Because for the first time ever, we dissected and exposed the network, we categorized it, we named the names, we traced the funding, we connected the dots, and we showed the genesis of several fictitious anti-Muslim boogeymen, anti-Muslim talking points, such as the following. Raise your hand, if you're still with me, if you've heard one of these in the last 4 years. President Obama is a Muslim. Okay, everyone. Sharia is a threat to America. Okay. Radical Islam has infiltrated America, the government, and mainstream Muslim organizations. Okay, most have. There is no such thing as moderate Islam. Traditional Islam is radical Islam. Most have heard that. And finally, practicing Muslims cannot be loyal Americans. Okay, pretty disturbing that everyone has raised their hand. I sometimes wish no one knows what I'm talking about, but everyone raised their hand right now. It shows you this is not just fringe extremist rhetoric, it's now mainstream. Specifically, the Islamophobia industry can be broken down into 5 groups. And I promise in 10 minutes you're going to walk away knowing it. Promise. Okay. 5 groups. This is how it works. Number 1, everything always begins with the money. The color green is the most powerful color in all the worlds. First is the money trail, the funding. We exposed 7 funders, and for sake of time, I won't go over them, but 7 funders who have given nearly $43 million to the Islamophobia network over the past 10 years. So number one, it begins with the money. Number two, where does the money go? Good question. The second group is what we call the intellectual nerve center, the brain of the Islamophobia network. Specifically, it goes to think tanks that are responsible for creating many of these memes. I'm going to talk about the Sharia threat, how it evolved and originated. So the second one is what we call the Islamophobia policy and scholars, this policy experts and scholars, what we call the nerve center. And specifically, the ones that we highlighted are Frank Gaffney of the Center for Security Policy, David Yerushalmi of the Society for National Existence, Robert Spencer from the blog Jihad Watch, and also a co-founder of the hate group Stop Islamization of America, along with Pam Geller, Daniel Pipes from the Middle East Forum, and Steve Emerson from the Investigative Project of Terrorism. Another person who deserves a shout out is David Horowitz of the David Horowitz Freedom Center, who also runs the online magazine Front Page Magazine, who also bankrolls Robert Spencer's Jihad Watch. As you will see, this is a very tight, interconnected, incestuous network. That's the second group. Now, this group creates the anti-Muslim talking points and memes through policy papers, reports, essays, and then these talking points enter into the dialogue, the local dialogue, by the third group, which is the grassroots groups and the religious right. So we got the money bankrolls the quote-unquote research done by these Islamophobia policy experts and scholars. They then disseminate this primarily to states and local communities through the grassroots groups, one of them being Act for America, which I'll talk about. Finally, this messaging gets mainstream thanks to the help to the mainstream media, the media megaphone. There is one news outlet in particular. On the count of three, let's do it. Let's see if Chicago gets it on the count of three. 1, 2, 3. Genius. Fox News, hate radio, online magazines, the blogosphere have been critical. And finally, the fifth is that these talking points that emerge from these papers literally end up in the mouth of political players. Literally, word for word, the anti-Sharia memes, you can pluck it from the policy paper, it ends up in the mouth of Herman Cain and Newt Gingrich. Okay? So, how did anti-Sharia emerge as a meme? The threat of creeping Sharia. Do I have 10 minutes? Great. You guys still with me? All right. I like it, the nod of the heads always like decrease as the time goes on. All right. The architect of the current anti-Sharia legislation is attorney David Yerushalmi. You'll be hearing his name a lot, I think, today. The Anti-Defamation League has written about Mr. Yerushalmi that, quote, he has a record of anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant, and anti-black bigotry. In a 2006 article, attorney David Yerushalmi even went so far as to claim that, quote, Muslim civilization is at war with Judeo-Christian civilization. The Muslim peoples, those committed to Islam as we know it today, are our enemies, end quote. Despite this illustrious history, he has been invited by elected officials such as Alaska's Carl Gatto to give expert testimony on Sharia. He has also appeared on mainstream press such as NPR to discuss Sharia, even though he's not a scholar in Islam, Islamic law, or Arabic. Mr. Yerushalmi also happens to be the attorney of Pamela Geller and Robert Spencer's hate group, Stop Islamization of America, a group criticized by both Southern Poverty Law Center and the Anti-Defamation League. Again, look how incestuous this network is. Specifically, that group was cited as being the predominant group to lead the protests against the quote-unquote Ground Zero Mosque in 2010, again, which was neither a Ground Zero nor a mosque, but deliberately mischaracterized as such by Pamela Geller on her blog in the spring of 2010. Furthermore, this meme of the mega mosque at Ground Zero was picked up, if you guys remember, by right-wing radio personalities, Rush Limbaugh, Sean Hannity, Glenn Beck, promoted on Fox News, who invited Ms. Geller and Robert Spencer and several members of the Islamophobia network several times on their shows, and then promoted on a grassroots level by Act for America, and of course, ended up in the mouths of political players running for midterm elections in 2010. Now, Mr. Yerushalmi is the founder of a think tank, surprise, surprise, called SANE, S-A-N-E. I'm not making that up. Society of Americans for National Existence, which in 2007 proposed legislation to make adherence to Sharia a felony punishable by 20 years in prison. So if anyone goes, if you see a Muslim praying after this, they're actually following Sharia, 20 years in prison. If a Muslim fasts during Ramadan, 20 years in prison. If a Muslim wears a hijab, the headscarf, 20 years in prison. If a Muslim is good to their neighbor, following Sharia principles, in all seriousness, 20 years in prison. In 2007, the same organization, SANE, initiated the, quote, Mapping Sharia in America project, Knowing the Enemy, to determine what type of Sharia was practiced in every single mosque and advocated by Muslim American religious institutions. David Gaubitz, who is the co-author of the CSP-funded conspiracy book Muslim Mafia, Inside the Secret Underworld, that's conspiring to Islamicize America, was SANE's director for this particular initiative. SANE's press release for the campaign stated the initiative would, quote, test the proposition that Sharia amounts to a criminal conspiracy to overthrow the United States government, end quote. Equating Sharia with criminality, David Yerushalmi further proposed legislation to make, again, adherence to Sharia a felony punishable up to 20 years in prison. Mr. David Yerushalmi's grossly misinformed assumption about Islam is probably due to the fact that he lacks, again, any formal academic training and scholarship in Arabic, Islamic sciences, and Islamic scholarship. And yet he's still touted as a national leading expert on Sharia. I just want to keep repeating that sometimes. He has a major ally and funder, okay, and this is a key architect, Frank Gaffney of the Center for Security Policy, a think tank which operates out of Washington, D.C. It's been operating since 1988. This is what Mr. Frank Gaffney says about Sharia. Do I have about 5 minutes left? Okay. This is what Mr. Frank Gaffney says. A mosque that is used to promote a seditious program, which is what Sharia is, that is not a protected religious practice. That is, in fact, sedition. Mr. Frank Gaffney has also said this, quote, I don't know much about Sharia, but I do talk about it a lot. He made $300,000 in 2010 talking about Sharia as a threat. Mr. Frank Gaffney has also said President Obama's administration has been infiltrated by radical Islam. He's accused the president of being Muslim. He has suggested the Conservative Political Action Committee has been infiltrated by radical Islam because it invited Grover Norquist to speak. He happens to be married to a Muslim. And because they invited longtime Republican Sohail Khan, a Muslim American, as speakers. CPAC has thereafter banned Frank Gaffney from ever attending the conference. He has also suggested that General Petraeus has succumbed to Sharia, and he has suggested the new defense missile logo, quote, appears ominously to reflect a morphing of the Islamic crescent and star with the Obama campaign logo, end quote. Seeing mysterious symbols and logos is further evidence of Gaffney's increasingly conspiracy-addled analysis. In 2010, the Center for Security Policy published the report Sharia, Threat to America, an exercise in competitive analysis, co-authored by William Boykin, Stephen Coughlin, Andrew McCarthy, James Woolsey, and David Yerushalmi. The name reappears. This report misidentified Sharia as the preeminent totalitarian threat to America, an illegal military political doctrine that seeks to supplant the Constitution. Okay, Mr. Boykin, a co-author of the document, has said the following. Islam should not be protected under the First Amendment. He has also said that there should be, quote, no mosques in America. In August, the co-author of this document, Mr. Boykin, privately met with presidential candidate Mitt Romney. Just throwing that out there. The Center for Security Policy's premise is that Sharia itself is a problem and the observance of Sharia results in extremism, which is, again, highly incorrect. And furthermore, their definition of Sharia is one that is utterly unrecognizable to any religious scholar of Sharia and the overwhelming majority of practicing American Muslims. Furthermore, they have said in that document, and this is where it all starts from, that 2010 document, that Muslims follow something called taqiyya, which they have misdefined as religiously mandated lying, suggesting that Islam commands Muslims to deceive. Now, if you ask most Muslims what's taqiyya, I guarantee you most Muslims would think it's a new taco released by Taco Bell that has like extra guacamole. All right, most Muslims have no idea. What taqiyya really means, it's an Arabic word that allows you to hide your faith in order to protect your life and family. It has a special allowance, very similar to Judaic and Christian rulings. A similar teaching can be found in Judaism. Maimonides, one of the great Jewish Torah scholars, taught that if one is allowed to lie about one's religion in order to save one's life. And yet you see how they misdefined it as religiously mandated lying. In 2011, Mr. Yerushalmi developed a template for the current anti-Sharia legislation entitled American Law for American Courts at the behest of the self-proclaimed nonpartisan advocacy organization American Public Policy Alliance. The organization claims one of the greatest threats to American values and liberties today comes from, quote, foreign laws and foreign legal doctrines, including Islamic Sharia law, that have been, quote, infiltrating our court system. The American Bar Association labeled Mr. Yerushalmi's document an anti-Sharia initiative, and furthermore added, many of the legislators sponsoring the anti-Sharia initiatives in other states are using model legislation drafted by the American Public Policy Alliance and David Yerushalmi. In 2011, Mr. Yerushalmi also worked with Frank Gaffney and the Center for Security Policy to release Sharia law and American state courts, an assessment of state appellate court cases, which evaluated 50 appellate court cases from 23 states alleging conflicts between Sharia and American law. The ACLU reviewed this, and in a 6-page document, thoroughly debunked it. In 2011, they released a report called Nothing to Fear, Debunking the Mythical Sharia Threat to Our Judicial System, and concluded, Frank Gaffney's think tank, CSP, promoted a, quote, mythical Sharia threat. The report rejected Mr. Yerushalmi's unsubstantiated claims of Sharia infiltration as wrong, and said it was based both on misinformation and misunderstanding of how our judicial system works. I'm finishing in 1 minute, I promise. And the ACLU furthermore suggested an insidious purpose behind the Islamophobes' crusade to criminalize Sharia. Quote, prohibiting U.S. courts from considering Islamic law serves only one purpose, to bar Muslims from having the same rights and access to courts as any other religious individuals. Jewish Americans in the past year have also begun protesting Mr. Yerushalmi and Frank Gaffney's anti-Sharia draft legislation due to their well-founded concerns that the law, if passed, would also affect their constitutionally protected rights of seeking redress in civilian courts for their religiously tailored contracts and transactions. So to end, and I went over my time, I'm so sorry. I can blab about this forever. Why are Sharia scare tactics problematic? By defining Sharia as a problem and as a totalitarian threat, quote, end quote, we assume all adherents of Sharia are violent extremists and threats. That, of course, means any practicing Muslim. That means 4 million American Muslims. This casts suspicion upon all observant Muslims as potential anti-American extremists and a disloyal fifth column. Politically and culturally, this inaccurate framing lends people to believe that Islam, and subsequently all self-identifying Muslims, are not only utterly incompatible with American values, but also an active hostile threat to the American way of life. And to show how this has a national security component to it and why it's so dangerous, I want to give a quick snapshot with my 30 seconds left. The reality that we're living in is that the FBI has said there's a 50% increase in anti-Muslim hate crimes. The Southern Poverty Law Center said there's a 300% increase in anti-Muslim hate groups. Furthermore, Islam has its lowest favorability rating ever. 40% of Americans say they don't want a Muslim as a neighbor. 30% say they don't want a Muslim as a president. Similar numbers say they don't want a Muslim in the Supreme Court. The Associated Press won a Pulitzer last year for doing a year-long expose on how the NYPD is doing wide-scale surveillance on American Muslim communities just for being Muslim. And there are a record number of bullying against Muslim schools, highest ever recorded in America. And as we have seen time and time again, extremist rhetoric inspires extremist violence. I will end, I promise, on this point. How the local becomes the national, becomes the international. Anders Breivik, the anti-Muslim Norwegian murderer who killed 77 people last year, left behind a 1,500-page manifesto, which frequently cites the writings of all the Islamophobic players I mentioned in my speech today, and many of them mentioned in Fear Incorporated. Specifically, upon reviewing his manifesto, counterterrorism expert Mark Sageman said the Islamophobic writings are the infrastructure from which Anders Breivik emerged. They are the ideological infrastructure from which this mass murder emerged. He said this rhetoric is not cost-free. So the irony is this, here people are making profit off of manufactured boogeymen. But the good news is this has happened time and time again to communities, happened to the Japanese American, African Americans, still happens to African Americans, Mexican immigrants, the LGBT community, Irish Catholics, and Jews. And what we have seen time and time again is that this narrative keeps playing the boogeyman keeps being replaced. Right now it's Muslims, but these fearmongers, these Islamophobes, always end up becoming the villains of our children's history books, and let's hope that happens with this case. Thank you for tolerating me, and I'm sorry for going over my time. I'm done.